Welcome back to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified. We're here to, break down all those tricky legal concepts, especially for all you law students out there hitting the books.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Today, we're diving deep into the Environment Protection Act of 1986,
Ah, yes.
the one everyone calls the Umbrella Act.
That's the one. It's a pretty important piece of legislation when it comes to environmental protection in India. Maybe even some would say the most important.
Right, it's like the foundation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so before we get lost in the legal jargon, can you give us the elevator pitch? Why is this act so crucial? And why does it have such a cool nickname?
Well, think of it this way. The EPA is like the mainframe of a computer, the operating system that runs everything else. Other environmental laws, like the Water Act or the Air Act, are like specific programs running on that mainframe.
Okay.
The EPA provides the core principles and the power to make those other laws work.
So it's not just about specific types of pollution. It's the overarching authority to address any environmental harm.
Exactly. And that's why it's called the Umbrella Act. It covers a wide range of environmental issues, from pollution control to hazardous waste management, and it gives the central government some pretty serious power to enforce those protections.
Okay, let's talk about that power for a second. What can the central government actually do under this act? Can they just waltz into a factory and shut it down if they think it's polluting?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but they do have significant authority. For example, remember that case a few years back where a chemical plant was releasing toxic waste into a river?
Oh, yeah.
The central government used the EPA to shut down the entire operation until they cleaned up their act and proved they could operate safely.
Wow. So they're not messing around. They actually can step in and stop industries in their tracks if they're harming the environment.
Right. And it's not just about shutting things down. The EPA gives them a whole toolkit to work with.
Right.
They can set environmental quality standards, regulate hazardous substances, even restrict certain industries from operating in ecologically sensitive areas.
So it's like they have a legal arsenal at their disposal to tackle a whole spectrum of environmental challenges.
Precisely. The EPA equips them with both preventive and remedial measures. They can stop environmental harm before it happens and take action to fix things when something goes wrong.
That's pretty impressive. But let's zoom in a bit. One of the things we wanted to focus on today was the idea of environmental impact assessment. It's a pretty hot topic in environmental law, right?
It is.
Why is it so important, and how does it fit into the bigger picture of the EPA?
It's absolutely crucial. Think of EIA as a sort of environmental crystal ball. Before any major project gets the green light, like a new highway or a big dam, the EPA mandates an assessment of its potential environmental impacts. What will happen to the local ecosystems, the air and water quality, the communities living nearby?
So it's not just about building things willy-nilly.
Right.
It's about considering the long-term consequences before you start digging and bulldozing.
Exactly. And this is where the EPA gets really interesting, at least from a legal perspective. The act doesn't just say, thou shalt consider the environment. It provides a legal framework to make that happen. It forces developers to think about sustainability from the very beginning.
That's actually a pretty powerful concept, right? It's not just about reacting to environmental damage. It's about baking those considerations into the planning stages of any major project.
Right. It's like preventative medicine for the environment. And this is one of the areas where we see a lot of legal action. Citizens and environmental groups can use the EPA to challenge projects that they believe haven't adequately considered the environmental impacts.
Okay, so this EIA process is a potential legal battleground.
It can be, yes.
What does that look like in practice? Have there been any major court cases where this part of the EPA was front and center?
Oh, absolutely. There have been some landmark cases that have really shaped how we understand and apply the EIA provisions of the EPA. Take the Godavarman case, for example. It involved the protection of forests in the Nilgiri Hills.
Wait, wasn't that about illegal logging? How does that connect to EIA?
That's the interesting part. The Supreme Court ruled that protecting these forests went beyond just stopping illegal activities. It required a comprehensive approach. And they used the EIA provisions of the EPA to mandate a long-term conservation plan for the entire region.
So they use the act to take a much broader, more holistic view of environmental protection.
Exactly. It wasn't just about catching the bad guys. It was about using the law to ensure the long-term health and sustainability of an entire ecosystem.
That's pretty amazing. It sounds like the EPA is a powerful tool not just for reacting to environmental damage, but also for proactively shaping a more sustainable future. But I know there's a lot more to unpack here, especially when it comes to how this act plays out in the courtroom. We've only just scratched the surface.
You're telling me. The case law surrounding the EPA is fascinating. And speaking of fascinating, did you know that there's a specific court dedicated solely to environmental issues in India?
Wait, seriously? Like a whole court just for environmental cases? Tell me more about that.
Well, that's a story for part 2 of our deep dive. Welcome back to LexTalks. Before we left off, we were talking about how the EPA isn't just about reacting to environmental damage. It's also about planning for a more sustainable future. And one of the key tools for that is the environmental impact assessment process.
Right, the EIA. It's like checking the environmental blueprint before you build that highway or dam. But you mentioned a whole court dedicated to environmental issues.
Yes.
What's that about?
It's called the National Green Tribunal, or NGT for short. It was set up in 2010 specifically to handle environmental cases, making it, well, easier and faster to address violations. Think of it like a fast-track court, but for the environment.
So instead of going through the regular courts, which can be a bit slow, anyone facing environmental issues can approach the NGT directly.
Exactly. That streamlined approach allows for, well, quicker resolutions and more effective enforcement of environmental laws, of course.
That's fascinating. Can you give us an example of a case the NGT has tackled?
Absolutely. There was a case a while back involving a construction project near a sensitive wetland. The developers hadn't properly considered the impact on the ecosystem, and local activists were concerned about the potential for flooding and damage to wildlife habitats. They took the case to the NGT, and the tribunal actually ordered a halt to the construction until a thorough environmental assessment was conducted.
Wow, so they actually have the power to stop projects in their tracks if they think the environmental impacts haven't been properly addressed. That's pretty significant.
Right, and it shows that the NGT isn't afraid to use its authority to protect the environment. They've also been involved in cases related to air pollution, industrial waste disposal, even noise pollution.
Okay, so we've got this powerful act, the EPA, and a dedicated court, the NGT, to enforce it. But you know what I'm curious about? How does all this actually play out in the courtroom? What are some of the landmark judicial decisions that have shaped how we understand and apply the EPA?
That's a great question. There are some truly fascinating cases that have had a huge impact on environmental law in India. One that comes to mind is the MC Mehta case, which dealt with vehicular pollution in Delhi.
Oh, yeah. Wasn't that back in the 90s? I remember reading about it.
I did.
Delhi was facing a major air pollution crisis,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And this case really showcased the power of the EPA to drive change. MC Mehta, a prominent environmental lawyer, filed a PIL, a public interest litigation that is, in the Supreme Court, arguing that the government wasn't doing enough to tackle the issue. The court, citing the EPA, directed the government to implement a series of measures, including the introduction of cleaner fuels like CNG.
So the EPA was used to force the government's hand and make them take concrete steps to improve air quality in Delhi.
Precisely. And the impact was huge. It led to a significant reduction in vehicular emissions and set a precedent for using the EPA to address air pollution across the country.
That's incredible. It's like the EPA was the legal weapon they needed to fight for cleaner air. What are some other key cases we should know about?
Well, another landmark judgment is the Vellore Citizens Welfare Forum case. This one tackled the issue of tanneries polluting the Pala River in Tamil Nadu.
Okay, so industrial pollution again. What was the outcome there?
This case was significant because it established the polluter pays principle in Indian environmental law. The Supreme Court, relying on the EPA, ruled that the tanneries responsible for the pollution had to bear the cost of cleaning it up. They couldn't just pollute and walk away.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you make the mess, you clean it up. Did the EPA have any other big wins in the courtroom?
Oh, there are so many cases we could talk about, but one more I'd like to mention is the Rural Litigation and Entitlement Kendra case. This one focused on limestone quarrying in the Doon Valley and its impact on the environment and local communities.
What happened there? Did the EPA come to the rescue again?
It did. The Supreme Court, relying on the EPA, ordered the closure of many of the limestone quarries, recognizing the need to balance economic development with environmental protection. This case was particularly significant because it highlighted the importance of protecting fragile ecosystems and the rights of local communities.
So it wasn't just about abstract environmental principles. It was about real people and their lives being impacted by environmental damage.
Exactly. And it shows how the EPA can be used to empower communities and give them a voice in environmental decision-making.
This is all so insightful.
Mm.
I'm starting to see how the EPA, along with these landmark judicial decisions, has really shaped environmental protection in India. But you know what I'm realizing? We've been talking a lot about the central government and the courts, but what about the states? Don't they play a role too?
You're absolutely right. The states have a crucial role in implementing and enforcing the EPA on the ground.
Welcome back to LexTalks. We were talking about the role of the states when it comes to the EPA. What kind of power do they actually have?
Well, it's a good point. While the central government, sets that big picture framework, those sweeping powers we talked about, the states are the ones on the ground, right? Making sure the act is actually put into practice.
So it's a bit like a federal system.
Yeah.
The central authority makes the rules, but the states have a lot of leeway in how they enforce them.
That's a great way to think about it. Each state has its own environmental department, pollution control boards. They work with the central government, but they also have, a lot of autonomy.
Okay, so what kind of things can those state-level bodies actually do? Can they, for instance, shut down a factory that's polluting a local river?
Absolutely. They can issue and enforce pollution control permits for industries,
Hmm.
conduct inspections, monitor emissions, and yes, even shut down facilities if they're breaking the rules.
Hmm.
They can also take legal action against polluters and impose fines.
So they're like the EPA's local enforcers, making sure everyone in their state is following the guidelines.
Exactly. They're the ones responding to complaints, investigating those violations, and really taking action to protect public health and the environment at a local level.
That makes a lot of sense. But what happens if a pollution issue crosses state lines? Like, what if a factory in one state is polluting a river that flows into another state? Who deals with that?
Ah, that's where things get a bit trickier. It's one of those classic challenges of environmental law. The EPA does encourage interstate cooperation
Hmm.
to handle those, transboundary issues.
So there's a system in place for states to work together
Right,
and try to find solutions that work for everyone.
right. There are mechanisms for sharing information and coordinating action, and if necessary, the central government can step in to mediate disputes or issue directives to make sure the problem is addressed.
It sounds like there's a whole web of legal and administrative processes to navigate.
Mhm.
But this all raises a big question in my mind. We've talked about the power of the EPA, the landmark court decisions, the role of the states. But is it all actually working? Is the EPA truly effective in protecting India's environment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that, well, sparks a lot of debate. There's no easy answer. The EPA has definitely achieved some major victories. We've seen improvements in air and water quality in some areas, and it's certainly raised awareness about environmental issues.
So there's been progress,
Yes.
but it's not a perfect system.
Right. There are still challenges. Enforcing environmental regulations in a country as vast and diverse as India is, well, it's a massive undertaking. And of course, there are always those who try to find loopholes or flout the rules.
I guess that's the case with any law, right? It's only as good as its enforcement.
Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of resources. Do the state pollution control boards have enough funding and personnel to effectively monitor all the industries within their jurisdiction? These are ongoing questions.
It sounds like we need a multi-pronged approach. Strong laws, effective enforcement, public awareness, and maybe even a bit of public pressure to keep everyone accountable.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's collective effort. We all have a role to play in protecting our environment.
Well said. It's been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the Environment Protection Act. Hopefully our listeners now have a better understanding of this complex but crucial piece of legislation.
I hope so too. It's fascinating to see how the law, the courts, and the actions of citizens all come together to shape environmental protection in India.
And for all you law students out there, remember, this is more than just theory. The EPA is a powerful tool for real-world change. Stay informed, get involved, and use your legal knowledge to make a difference.
Couldn't agree more.
And that brings us to the end of another episode of LexTalks. Thanks for joining us on this legal journey. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep those legal minds sharp.